Hey everyone, this is JM. I'm coming to you with a special guest, a Mr. Paul Cunningham. He's a friend of mine. He is a historical fiction author. So the previous episode, if you caught the previous episode, we talked about world building in fantasy fiction. And we discussed some of the basic principles and the mechanics of how to go about actually writing conveying world building information to your readers. And I had a thought that a lot of what we do in fantasy as a subgenre is very similar to what is done in historical fiction. And Paul Cunningham happens to be a friend of mine. Also, he's part of a informal peer review group that I meet with about once a month. So he reads over my material and gives me comments, and I read over his material. And he's just very, very good at building a world within historical fiction that is believable and accurate. He does a lot of research. Paul is the author of a book called Contention, which is available on Amazon. You can pick it up on Kindle Limited, or paperback. The book details the Rome featured in the Roman Empire after the death of Nero. Yeah. So why don't you introduce yourself first, Paul, and tell us about Contention, and then we'll get more into the topic at hand.
All right. Well, thanks for having me in, and I'd be happy to talk about Contention, which is the story of a single year, 69 AD, in the Roman Empire, which is probably the most eventful, chaotic year in the history of that empire. When Nero died, there weren't any successors, any obvious successors, because he'd killed all of his potential rivals, including his family members.
No, that'll do it.
So there was a kind of a scramble for the throne, and there were 4 emperors in succession over the course of that year. Some of them were assassinated. One of them killed himself. Rome was sacked. It was civil war. It was a very thrilling, exciting time.
That particular book, how is it framed? What is the narrative format for that book?
The framing story is the Roman historian Tacitus was writing the history of this year about 35 years after it happened. And he employs his slave, his kind of personal secretary, to go out and do some research. He wants him to talk to the lower class people who Tacitus doesn't want to talk to, and get stories like from slaves' eye views, kind of common soldiers' eye views, people in the street. So the story is basically this slave story. His name is Actus, and he talks to a lot of people and kind of writes up these stories of these people who saw those events from the point of view of ordinary people.
Great. I very strongly recommend you guys go out and pick up that book. Like I said, Paul is very, very good at what he does, historical fiction. And just like with fantasy, it's hard to, I think people know a lot about say the Roman Empire. People think they know a lot about the Roman Empire, but we really don't. I mean, a lot of what we know is popular culture versions of something. It's really hard to get into the head of someone who is 2,000 years old, and to get into a totally different culture, a totally different way of living, a totally different way of thinking. So when you're doing historical fiction, you have to convey those new ideas. It's almost like describing a new world to your reader, with the added burden of trying to be accurate and doing your research, which I think Paul is very good at. So to jump into the interview that I have planned out, the first thing I wanted to ask you, Paul, was why historical fiction? How did you get started writing historical fiction?
As a writer, you're often advised to write what you know, but I want to write about things that I don't know because I want to learn something new. And I've always been just naturally inclined to history. I've always enjoyed reading historical fiction. If you read a well-researched historical novel, you're going to learn a bunch of stuff and be thrilled and entertained. And I'm kind of inspired by other fiction writers to do that.
Do you have any examples of other historical fiction writers that you like or that you follow?
Yeah, I was inspired by writers like Robert Graves, who wrote I, Claudius. There was another guy called Alan Massey, who wrote a series of books about the Julio-Claudian emperors. And that stuff, it's not always completely historically accurate, but it does get you inside the minds of people who lived 2,000 years ago. And in many ways, their minds they think in the same way as we do in many ways, but in other ways, they're utterly alien. Like, one thing is like the acceptance of slavery. Like, nobody questioned that as a social system. Not even the slaves questioned it, except perhaps Spartacus, apart from him. And like the main guy in my book, he's a slave, and he's like totally fine about being a slave.
So Roman question, was decimation a real thing?
Oh yeah.
And that was just kind of something that happened and was to be expected, or?
It was a real thing back in the days of the Republic. It was definitely a thing when Rome was expanding. By my period, it wasn't really a thing. But yeah, they would like pick one guy out of every 10, and his 9 buddies would beat him to death with wooden sticks.
And then when that happened, I mean, the reaction from the public would be, oh, that just kind of happens sometimes.
The public would never see it, because it would happen.
Yeah.
It would happen like after a battle. You know, if they didn't hold the line, if they ran away, that was when it happened. So the public probably wouldn't see it. They'd be aware of it, and they'd just be like, "Yeah, that's just like what happens to soldiers who don't stand." Yeah.
So you like historical fiction because you like the learning and the researching aspect of it.
Yeah, I love that.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So how do you go about researching for a project? Because the thing that I notice when I read your writing is you just have so much information in there. It's really like weird, trivial things that are not common knowledge. Like, there's something in your current work in progress. What was it? It was something about bees and beer.
Oh yeah. They used to. Beekeepers, bee handlers would soak their hands in beer, and they would wash their faces in beer, and it was something to do with odor, something to do with the smell.
So they didn't get stung?
I can't recall now exactly why they did it, but it was something to do with the odor, and I got that from a 17th century beekeeping manual, which I downloaded. Like, with the age we live in now, these books, like, you can't get them in print. But so there are good people scanning these things, and you can just
and that's the kind of thing where a detail like that just jumps out at you is where does that come from? But it makes it feel genuine, because it feels right, and it feels accurate, and it feels like you know what you're talking about. So something like that, like, how do you do research when you have a project, you're working on a new project, and you've got the setting and you've got kind of the characters? Where do you go from there?
Before I started to write my current project, I spent a whole year reading, and I read histories of the period, and I read novels that were written in that period. I wanted to get it into my bones. I wanted to immerse myself in that period. And yeah, I did that for a whole year, and I lived and breathed it for a year before I started to write. And without doing that, I wouldn't really have the confidence to write about that world, because it's an alien world, and you have to live in it for a while before you can explain it to other people.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I can kind of see that being very similar writing fantasy. And one of the things that I've kind of been working on with the new anthology and of Metal and Magic is writing all these side articles and things where it allows me to kind of dive into the characters a little bit deeper and examine the history a little bit more and tease out new ideas. When I wrote my first book, In the Valley of Magic, one of the things I was doing at the same time I was writing that book is I was writing flash fiction on my blog with other characters and other aspects of the world to start to build and to tease out that world to have a better understanding. So yeah, I get that, wanting to immerse yourself in the world so you can understand it deeply.
Mm-hmm.
What about like your sources and resources and things that you use to do your research?
I read a lot of Daniel Defoe, who was not only a novelist but also a journalist. He wrote a lot of nonfiction. He had his own newspaper, which he published. He wrote it and published it himself. Sources like that are easy to get now. You can get that stuff online. I read a lot of stuff by modern historians who've analysed that period. So it was a mix of modern historians and primary sources.
When you mentioned finding the old beekeeping manual, how did you think to look for that, or did you stumble on it? How did you find it? Just Googling
I
it,
just
or
Googled, yeah. I just Googled 17th century beekeeping, and that came up.
What spurred on that search? Why did you know you needed to look for beekeeping?
I just wanted.
Because you had a particular scene with beekeeping in it, and
yeah. I don't know why I wanted to have a beekeeping scene. I just thought it would be cool. I thought, well, before I write this scene, I need to know how they did it and how they went about doing it. Also, there's going to be there's a metaphor, and it's a very small part of the story, but there's going to be a point when my main character is in the army, and at that time, soldiers were they were automatons. They weren't expected to think. They just had to march in a straight line, fire their gun like once every minute or whatever it was, their musket, and they were puppets. They had no mind of their own.
So a bit of
that's how bees
allegory
kind of work. Yeah. And that's going to connect at some point, but that wasn't really a big deal. But I just thought it would be a cool way to, it's something that we don't have now, really, isn't it?
Okay, so you've got your concept and you've done the research. Now, what we talked about in our previous episode, kind of the hardest part is, how do you convey that information to the reader without being overwhelming or dry or annoying or a myriad of other bad things that are going to turn your reader off? Because I feel like you do a really good job of conveying the world building and the historical information without being boring.
Yeah, that's a really difficult tightrope to walk, and you always have to remember to put the story first, tell the story, put the characters first, and drop in the historical details as they're relevant, as they connect with the story, and don't try to distort the story or twist it just so that you can show off all the stuff that you know. It's hard to keep it natural, and you end up like knowing or actually using like maybe 5 or 10% of what you know, because most of what you know doesn't really fit with your story. But yeah, you have to keep it. You don't want it to be a lecture. You don't want it to read like a history textbook. You want it to be a story first and foremost.
Well, one of the things you do really good is narrative and character voice. It sounds like these people are living, breathing people from your current work is what, 17th century?
Yeah, late 17th century.
And you do that through use of just words and phrases and slang and idioms and things like that. Where do you get that from? Just reading other historical novel books, or?
That came from reading novels that were written round about that period. Especially Daniel Defoe, who was just like so prolific. He wrote about so many different things. And his characters always have great voices. He's kind of a ventriloquist, and there's a lot of dialogue in his books. Some of the phrases that I've prepared a cheat sheet here.
Yeah, so what are some of your favorites?
The kind of thing that I would use is something like, okay, we say now save for a rainy day.
Yeah.
In those days, they said save for a wet day. Now that's just familiar enough to work and just different enough to be intriguing. Also, hawk's-eyed instead of hawk-eyed. broad awake instead of wide awake. Those are the kind of things that don't sound too weird. Some stuff that you couldn't use, like for exclamations, odd rabbited, Zoodikers, which that just sounds comical, and I don't want it to be a comedy.
I would totally use Zoodikers.
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 So yeah, you have to. There are things that work and things that don't work. Whistle drunk is a good one. Instead of blind drunk, I'm going to use that. Lost a cool 100 in gambling. I lost a cool 100. Now that sounds too modern to me. I wouldn't use that. But that is 300 or 400 years old, that expression.
Huh.
So I wouldn't use that one. Prepositions are interesting. We would say stabbed in the heart. They would say stabbed to the heart. Quake for fear instead of quake in fear.
Oh, that is very interesting.
Big of his age instead of big for his age. Yeah. But if you read
I think I marked some of those wrong when I was peer reviewing you.
Probably, yeah. I hope they don't get picked up like by the Amazon grammar checker or anything.
Yeah. Amazon isn't.
But yeah, I went through those books. I underlined tons of stuff as I was going through them. I filled notebooks full of idioms and slang expressions. I read over those notebooks until I think I've got a library of like probably hundreds of that kind of thing in my head. As I'm writing, if I can use it, I'll use it.
Do you have a particular favorite idiomatic expression from that period? Other than Zoodikers?
I don't have a particular favorite, no, because like you can only really use them once. If you repeat them, then it's going to sound labored. So no, I don't have a favorite, but I have a library up here, tapping my forehead, in the custody of physic, which means that you're under the doctor. But I think that's a little bit too arch. I don't think I'd use that one. Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, because I wouldn't jump straight to thinking doctor as far as physic. I would think physics as far like custody of physics. I would think of physical restraint.
Well, that's it. Yeah. When you talk about a physic, that was a doctor.
Yeah.
But that might be a little bit too alien, and it's gonna like throw the reader out of the story.
I think it depends on the context. I think if it's obvious that you're talking about a doctor or he's with a doctor and you inject that, if the context is obvious, then it might be an eye-opening experience for the reader to be like, oh, there's an interesting phrase I've never heard before.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think if the context clarified it, things like that can work better, definitely.
So, just to wrap things up, do you have any other comments, insights, anything about the historical fiction genre? Any tips or tricks?
I don't think I can teach anybody anything about it, because there is no. The only technique I have is to read a ton of stuff and then try to internalize it, and it's very time consuming, and it's not something that everyone is going to want to do.
Well,
I love it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a general tip for any author is you need to read more. Something I'm not that good with. I read a lot, or I listen to a lot of audiobooks, but I lean more towards nonfiction. I don't do enough reading in my own genre. So knowing where previous authors have gone and what the trends are and things like that is hard, especially when you're in a genre, writing genre fiction where trends and markets and stuff are so important.
Yeah, that's something that I have to say I'm not very good at. I keep getting told that historical fiction is mostly a woman's market, and that women probably won't want to read the kind of story that I write. But I'm not sure. I'm not so sure that that's true. My stuff might be a little bit niche, and I don't really care. I'm just going to write what I want to write.
There's definitely a historical romance genre geared toward women, like
Bodice Rippers.
Yeah.
And that's very much of the period that I'm writing.
I'm in love with Henry VIII type novels.
That kind of thing does sell, I think. Yeah.
Romance of any type sells.
Yeah, it always does. Yeah. And I think the mistake I made with my first book was that I only wrote it for me, and the only people who are going to love it are people who are just like me. And I think
Uh,
that's a fair criticism. My second one, I think, will have a broader appeal, but I don't think it's going to be
I don't know. I think
that broad.
the one you're working on right now is really good. It's gonna be something. But yeah, the one that you did before, just to remind everyone, is called Contention, and it's available on Amazon. If you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it as part of Kindle Unlimited, or you can get a paperback. Um, but yeah, I highly recommend it. And thanks for dropping by. And
Thanks for having me in. It's been a pleasure.
I will catch you guys next time. The next episode, episode 4, we're going to talk about the short story in all its glory. So, writing, formatting, publishing, any questions you have about the short story format, that's kind of my forte. But we'll see you next time.